So in this video, we are going to be looking at another feature of our grids here, and that is going to be column gaps, column and row gaps. So we've looked at aligning content, we've looked at creating columns and rows. Now we're going to look at the final piece that kind of connects everything together for our containers, which are gaps. So we've talked about how our grid is kind of set up. We have our boxes, we have our columns and our rows, and then we can actually change these or override them using our justifications here. I'm actually going to go ahead and erase these or comment them out just for this lecture so we can create some good demonstrations here. So what I'm going to be doing is going through and talking about these gaps, and they're actually pretty important when it comes to the whole thing because you can completely change the way a grid looks by creating spacing. And obviously if you've seen any websites and really look closely at it, you'll understand the importance of spacing in websites. They really bring everything together and create sort of a hierarchy that's easy on the eyes if you've taken any UX or design. So let's get started. Now what I'm going to be doing is going ahead and creating these column and row gaps. So the first one I want to talk about is column gaps. And just as we were working with our template columns and template rows, the properties that we need to use are pretty similar. So first I'm going to go ahead and start with our columns. Now the property that we're going to be using is grid column gap. And you can obviously kind of associate these together to memorize them or maybe learn them easier. But besides that, we're going to go ahead and get this started. Now, of course, this only takes one value. We don't need to specify any more because what we're going to be doing is giving each column a gap between them. So let's go ahead and give it a value. I'm just going to go ahead and say 150 pixels to make it a little bit evident. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page, and although it may not be obvious immediately, you can kind of see that these columns are a little bit more spaced out now. Now, of course, there's no lines to kind of show you the visualization, but you can kind of deduce from this that there is definitely a bigger gap between the columns now that we've specified it. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and actually change this and give it a row gap. So very similar to our previous property, we're going to use grid row gap. And this is pretty much the exact same thing, except it specifies the gap between rows. So this is probably going to be a lot more obvious here. What I'm going to do is just going ahead and saying 300 pixels, and notice how the gap of this place kind of gets bigger. You can see now that there is a much bigger gap between our top row and our bottom row. So that's pretty easy, but obviously you don't want to go through and specify these every single time. So there's actually a really nice shorthand property that we can use to bring this all together. I'm going to go ahead and I'll keep these for now and then I'll erase them when we're done. So instead of specifying which axes you want to do it on, or which axis, sorry, you can just say grid gap. And what this is going to do is just create the gap instantly where you can pass in two values and specify it or do it all in one go. So this takes the column first and then the row, kind of just how template columns goes first and template rows go first in its shorthand, which we haven't actually talked about, but we'll get to that later. For here, what we're going to do is specify our column first, which is 150 pixels, and our row gap next, which is 300 pixels. Now I'm going to go ahead and erase these other values that we don't need and refresh the page. So I actually made a little mistake there and I put the column before the row. Sorry if I caused any confusion there. So what I'm going to do is actually just go ahead and change this really quickly so that this will work. And now if I go ahead and refresh, you can see that they look exactly the same. Again, sorry for that mix-up. Just remember that the row or the row size comes before the column size. Just keep that in mind. So there we go. Now we have our grid gap set up. Now this is pretty much it for our, column gap or row gap, or all of these gaps for our grid layout. Now there's really not that much to it. It's very easy to set up, but once you do that, it becomes very easy to sort of work with your grid along with the other properties to create some really nice looking layouts. And once we start learning some more of the properties in the next few videos, you can really maximize the use of the grid layout in CSS. Alright, let's move on.